Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ricardo Martínez. I'm a senior research fellow in global cities at CIDOB, the Barcelona Center for International Affairs. I'm very happy to have today a conversation with Aromar Revi, the founding director of the Indian Institute of Human Settlements. So happy to see you, Aromar, and thank you so much for accepting our invitation.
Thank you, Ricardo. It's really nice to catch up after a very long time.
Absolutely. My first question is about the Global South. It's far from being an homogeneous geographical category, is, however, very useful when we talk about cities, because most of the current global wave of urbanization is taking place in these regions of the world. So I would like to pose you two questions in this regard. The first question is, how would you describe the main challenges and demands of cities in the Global South? And the second question is, how would you describe the main opportunities and capacities of cities in the Global South? Aromar.
So I think, Global South is a very wide term in some senses, and especially at least those of us who worked across cities pretty much across the world, post-COVID, or certainly during COVID, I think you saw in what were earlier seen as global north cities, the Global South kind of boiling up, partially because of inequality, partially because in some senses, citizens in many parts of the world really struggled. So in some senses, the Global South is actually the Global South. It's not about a geography. It's about certain orientation, about access to, basic things that you would expect citizens and cities to access. Of course, a lot of the geographies are in this, in the, within quotes, the South in parts of cities in Latin America, Europe, Asia, and in Africa. And, we know what the demographic numbers are like. About 90% of our incremental addition to cities will be happening in cities of Asia, and then much more critically Africa, over the next 20 or 30 years. So that's the question of geography. But I think the key thing for us is trying to understand how, in a sort of era in which we have planetary urbanism in some senses, how does one deal with critical questions in every location? And it's not only the large megacities. I would say the biggest challenges, or in some senses the most interesting opportunities, are in the smaller urban centers, whether it's in Europe or in parts of Asia, etc. These urban centers are places which have a tremendous amount of dynamism. Fine. They have the right scale that's there, but they struggle. They struggle because in the overall urban hierarchy, and the urban hierarchy sits within a national hierarchy, there's not too much of emphasis and attention that's given to what they would actually, what they can do in these places. So when we're looking at the question of the Global South, we have to differentiate it not only by, region and continent and country, but we also have to differentiate it by the kind of spaces and places we're talking about, all the way from small towns. In India, a small town might be 100,000 people, which is like a city in Europe, or all the way up when you're going from small towns through, 100,000, 500,000 cities to million cities. And then in many parts of the world, especially in Latin America, Europe, and Asia, you have these mega cities and mega urban regions that can go to 20, 30, in the next few decades or so, 40 million people or so. So these spaces, in some senses, are defining not only the political geography of the countries in which they are, because they have so many people in them, but they're certainly redefining economic geography. And economic geography is not only in terms of economic output that people have, the incomes that they earn, but also questions of where work exists. Because I think one of the core questions of the early mid 21st century, as the nature of work is changing, is, where is that going to be? And especially in parts of the world where either populations are very young. So in India, for example, our mean population age is under 30 or so. Same things in parts of Africa, or even in other places where we have aging populations. The question of how work and where people will work and how they will continue to earn their livelihoods and contribute to the economy is, I think, a very, very serious question. And the cities of the Global South, in some senses, are redefining, and they've been doing that not, I would say, 20 or 30 years, our earlier canonical kind of imaginations of work and place. So in the in the industrial age, and even I would say in the 20th century, many cities, especially in North America, also to some extent in Europe, you had this coalescence of industrial activity. Of course, services became important, but the idea of, people would be occupied in a particular profession and a particular place for pretty much the extent of their lives, right? That is very dramatically different now in cities of the global south, partially because of informality. People come in either because they're born in informal settlements in the city, or they come in from smaller places, smaller towns or villages in other parts of the global south, and they have to find a mix of opportunities for themselves. And typically, many of them will be working in many different places. They may not necessarily be, technically qualified to work in a particular industry or a particular role, but they'd have to do that because that's how they can survive. And because the informal economy, in some senses, is both porous and also has limitations of mobility, it creates a very different economic landscape that's there. So, this informality of space and work, and of course, economic relations, I think is something that's going to be very important to us, especially as we see the penetration of both digital technologies. And now, of course, there's a lot of hype about artificial intelligence. This is going to create a very different kind of an environment in the cities of the global south that you can see in other places. So the common things, of course, is, you're concentrating large numbers of people, so there'll be increased economic productivity. There will hopefully be more livelihoods and livelihood opportunities. People come to cities to try and make their lives better, but very often, because the nature of the urban infrastructure, access to land markets, even access to jobs is very unequal. A large number of people, or maybe a significant fraction of people in many of the cities in the global south and Africa and Asia, they struggle to access this, and they struggle not only for a few years but sometimes for multiple generations to find a foothold in the urban context. So unlike other places that were settled, that were a little bit more organized, where labor was, had a strong voice in how things are actually working, partially because of informality and the gig economy, etc. We're going to find a lot more fluidity in these contexts. But the fact that we're able to bring together people, productivity increases are significant, but at the same time, environmental and other challenges are quite important. Is kind of is a particular characteristic. The other thing, of course, over the last whatever 250 years or so, since the beginning of the industrial revolution, cities are the place where significant social and political changes take place. So whether you go to the Commune of Paris or you go to a whole range of other places across the world, significant social and political movements have really coalesced and have originated from urban contexts. Whether it's dealing with access to universal access to education, or even to being able to vote, or women's rights to equality, these movements have started with an urban context. Now we're seeing similar things, but in a very different sort of environment happening in cities of the global south, partially because the context of now and maybe 100 years ago, or certainly 150 years ago, is quite different. We have a larger number of people who are educated. You have a whole range of new technology and access to information and knowledge in some senses. And because of digital participation in a whole range of processes, you find the ability to, make or unmake governments, to be able to participate in economic and political activity much more significantly. So there's I would say, a new opportunity for democracy that might be emerging. The challenge is that our former systems of governance in the countries that many of our cities are situated in are still either situated in the 20th century, or in some cases maybe even in the 19th. So that rigidity in our governance frameworks and imagination is something that's holding back opportunities, I would say, in urban contexts across the world. So a big shift in our perception of governance. In some cases, it will mean significant changes in constitutional arrangements, in legal arrangements for sure, to give places that today have 1 million people. 100 years ago, that would be the entire population of a country. Fine. Now you find 1 million people sitting in one city, and it's not a very large one in some senses. So how does one reimagine democratic activity? How does one reimagine participation? How does one reimagine equality in a digital age? Are some of the really interesting questions that will be, I think, sorted and answered in the cities of the global south, partially because there's so much of activity happening, and there's so much of innovation that happens not only on the technical side. People see the technical innovation and they get enamored by it. I think the social innovation is really where a lot of the processes actually lie. But the contrary is also true, and that is that a lot of cities in the global south, they accentuate and they concentrate poverty, inequality, and hence conflict. So you have to balance these things out, the opportunities and the challenges, and of course they are typically very poorly resourced, both in terms of money and in terms of institutional capacity, because that's the way that the states in which they're embedded have typically looked at local governments. Local governments are there to deliver, not necessarily engage and try and solve problems, which is what they've been doing so successfully, I would say, in the last 2 or 3 decades or more. So, that's a broad sense of it. Obviously, it's going to be different in different contexts in the world.
Thank you so much, Aromar. And indeed, you have addressed both challenges and opportunities. You have already touched a bit upon it, but let's move specifically to your country, to India. In 2023, India overtook China as the world's most populous country. And well, the current wave of urbanization in India is simply unprecedented. What could you tell us in a broad brush lens? What could you tell us about the state of cities in India?
Well, I guess the first thing is that, India is, or South Asia, because this is not only true of India, it's true of other parts of South Asia also, whether you take Bangladesh or Sri Lanka, Nepal, Pakistan, etc. Similar kind of trends that are there. We've started maybe, a decade ago on the kind of urban transformation or urban revolution that China started on in the early 1990s. And as you know, as we all know, China has been the largest it's been a 300 million or more people coming to urban areas. So it's the largest urban transformation in history. It's happened in less than 2 generations, so it's happened in maybe 30 odd years. So the pace of change and transformation is very substantial. Of course, that has brought many advantages to China. China's per capita GDP has gone up dramatically. India and China were almost the same level in the 1990s, but China now has a per capita GDP that's about 4 times India's, partially because of the way that they manage their process of urbanization, infrastructure development, and investment, and of course the opening up of their economy. So similar things will happen in South Asia and India particular. But I think the thing that I'd like to highlight is, we have some particular challenges in the 21st century. First of all, we have a very large global population. So, we've got to go to 8 to 10 billion people, which is, 2 doublings over what it was just after the Second World War, when the current international order was kind of established in some senses. So a lot of people, and of course, in the parts that we're talking about, in extremely large concentration. So you take all of South Asia, it's well over 2 billion people. So it's much more than China is in some senses. So that creates opportunities. If you create market-based opportunities, India, in some senses, is going to emerge as the single largest integrated market in the world. So, everybody across the world, including from North America, Europe, etc., want to come in and be able to trade inside India and do things in India because the economic size is actually growing. But the challenge is a little bit more interesting, and that is 2 things. The first thing is, this is not only a question of people moving to cities and becoming citizens in urban context. It's fundamentally a change of culture. So you have a culture which has had a stable form of settlement structure for, I would say, 2,000 years. Basically an agrarian structure that was there, that till the 1960s and 70s was very stable for at least a couple of 100 years. So, of course, like many other parts of the world, India, China, Japan, in the 18th century had a fairly large share of urban population. So there was the overall urban population that time was between 15 and 20%. During the process of colonization, actually, the urban share dropped because that was the impact of colonization in some senses that actually happened. And now it's building back, very, very, very rapidly. So this big shift is not so much just a demographic shift; it's a cultural shift. So an entire population of 1 billion+ people, which has been traditionally rural, agrarian, hierarchical in our particular context, caste and gender are deep asymmetries, is now becoming more urban. So there are 2 things. One, of course, is just a shift of culture, but much more critically so, the shift of imaginations. So the imaginaries of an earlier pre-colonial urbanism no longer hold in the current context, both in terms of scale and in terms of histories and cultures that are there. The other forms of urbanism that you see from other parts of the world that come from, even Asian cities like Singapore or those in West Asia, in the Gulf, or even Chinese cities, don't hold in our context. The reason that they don't hold is we still have a very large rural population. So India at the moment, at 1.4 billion people, has about two-thirds of its people in rural areas and one-third in urban. So one thing, of course, is people are enamored about the whole, question of people shifting, both because of urban growth within urban centers, but also from rural to urban areas. But I think there are some critical questions that we forget, and that is, 1.5 billion people do need to eat. They need to get water. Some basic ecological services have to be available. And unfortunately, whether it's Western cities or Chinese cities or even our cities, we have not been able to reimagine the urban region as a place that can, produce food, that can produce ecological services, that can deal with things like water and even air pollution in some senses in a sensible way. So for us, I think India has a particular opportunity, which is very different from the Chinese opportunity. And maybe some countries in Africa will also seize this, of trying to keep the balance between the so-called rural cultures and the urban cultures. Now, Europe, you find this, but that's over a period of 250 years of history. But for us to be able to hold on to this thing, I would say over the next 2 or 3 pivotal decades is going to be very important, because when you find that you destroy a rural agrarian culture, which is actually creating the food security that a large urban population is actually dependent on, you create dependencies which are very, very severe and constrained. We saw what happened with the fall of the Soviet Union in the late 80s and early 90s, and part of that crisis was a crisis of food security and trading relationships and economic development, etc. So I think one of the interesting opportunities we have in India is to be able to maintain an agrarian culture where we're improving the quality of life of people in smaller places. And we have a lot of smaller places. We have at the moment about 650,000 smaller places, villages. And we have maybe 10, 12,000 urban centers that are there. So 2 orders of magnitude difference. So maintaining that balance, I think, is very important, because in the 21st century, with both the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis accelerating over the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years, if you don't maintain that, the cities will implode upon themselves and collapse. So you've got to look at the entire settlement spectrum, like I said, from smaller places and villages. Many of them will coalesce. In India, we may lose 100,000 villages, but 100,000 out of 600,000 is a small number. It's less than 15%. But you need to maintain that hierarchy to be able to make sure that the benefits of economic development and job creation do reach smaller places. But the things that come from there, especially, like I said, food, fiber, maintaining a biodiversity, which are very, very critical to our long-term survival, are actually maintained. So in that sense, I think India has a slightly different pathway from many other parts of the world to be able to actually reach out and do something different. The other thing that's very different from in India and even China is, we have historically now, at least for the last 75, almost 80 years since independence is now, we have been a services-led economy. So India had a manufacturing sector, but the manufacturing sector was never more than, let's say, 20% of the GDP. Now, China changed very dramatically since 1990, because it became the factory of the world. Manufacturing became the engine that drove growth on the eastern Chinese seaboard, and pretty much then, as the networks developed across the Chinese territory. In India, that's quite different. So, of course, we've done pretty well in some services sector, especially in IT and BT and innovation, and we'll see a big, big set of clusters building out on artificial intelligence in India. But the challenge for us is to be able to try and build significant manufacturing capacity, not maybe like China did to be able to export, though that is useful, but really to cater to domestic demand, right? Because we are now having to import a whole range of things that come from places like China, Southeast Asia, and maybe even from Europe, Africa, less from Latin America, to be able to take care of the basic products and services, I would say products that people require. So there's a very large domestic market. So building the manufacturing sector, especially manufacturing sector that has got integrated into it, a lot more IT and services, is going to be a huge opportunity for India. But still, services is going to be the key driver of the economy. So you've got to make sure that the economic sector that sits in the primary sector, which is agriculture, animal husbandry, and fisheries, etc., are significant. India is the largest producer of milk in the world, and it's a very, very important driver of economic activity in particular parts of the country. It's also very important for nutrition. So you need to be able to keep security as far as that is concerned, which is then tied to place, because it's about managing water, it's about managing soil, it's about managing markets locally, and the linkage to small agricultural market towns, which again is similar in other parts of the world. Again, in some parts of Europe, you still find that kind of relationship that's there. You've got to be able to build manufacturing centers that cater to domestic demand. Some cases, high tech manufacturing and otherwise will be able to cater to other parts of the world, especially as China, for example, becomes less competitive as the wages rise there. So there's opportunities in that space that's there. And of course, India will maintain its strength and its capacity in services, because our education system is now putting out 15, 20 million young people every year. So literally in a decade, we will educate and put out from our education system the population size almost that of Europe, which will go into the services sector industry. So the question then is, how does one build a settlement system or a framework where you're able to deal with these close clusters in some cases, but also be able to deal with regional balances? Because in India, one of the big challenges we have is a lot of our population growth is happening towards the north and the east of the country. There's a demographic transition happening in the south and the west, and hence the incomes are higher there. So how do you actually take the jobs and the economic opportunities and infrastructure to the places where the people are, rather than having them to migrate dramatically inside the country? I think that's going to be the interesting thing that's there, because we have the ability now, because of technology in some senses, because investments are rising and the ability to build an infrastructure that is improving in India, to actually make that happen. I mean, you need to invest, 3, 4, 5% of your GDP to actually build that out. China has shown that very, very successfully to us. So I think there's a different way of development that we're going to experience here potentially. And it's very important for us because we're extremely vulnerable as far as climate is concerned. And even though we have maybe 20+% of our population, of our area, um, under forests and some form of conservation, that's going to be a very critical question for us also in time. And I think from that experience, we probably have a lot to both learn and give to Africa, and certainly colleagues in Latin America. But of course, in Latin America, you have large urban populations, but you don't have in the gross such 500 million people actually in urban areas. The numbers are a little bit smaller. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to learn here, and to share and try and find particular pathways. And India is a subcontinent in some senses. It is a very, very diverse region. So it's not a homogeneous country. So there are going to be lots of different ways that these things will play themselves out regionally, in terms of resources, and of course in terms of risks that are there. Coastal cities are very different from mountain cities. In India, we have the high Himalayas, we have islands, we have a lot of things that we have to sort of hold on to and build on.
Thank you so much, Aromar. Indeed, the huge changes, a lot to do, a lot to learn. I also see. You, of course, touched upon climate change, and this was my next question. You've played leading roles in multiple assessment cycles of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. In the AR7, you are one of the coordinating lead authors of the first chapter of the special report on climate change in cities. We are very excited about it. I wanted to ask you, again, broadly speaking, what could you tell us about the state of urban climate action, especially in terms of climate adaptation?
Well, to be very frank, we're doing very badly. And I can say that, I mean, the unfortunate thing is that, so I co-led the chapter which kind of created in the IPCC the space for climate action way back. It was more than a decade ago. And I think in 2014, when we produced the first chapter on urban areas, what we effectively said was, if the world unfortunately gets closer to 2 degrees centigrade, forget about 2, at 1.5 elevation above the post-industrial, that's an average, not in particular cities, but an average across the world, we're going to be in real trouble. And we showed way back, like I said, this is well before Paris, that it really didn't matter where you were in, whether you were sitting in, Barcelona or London or New York or in Dar es Salaam or Mumbai. Eventually, if the temperatures really go up that much, the thing that is going to be common across these cities, irrespective of income level, technology, etc., is the ecosystem services which start collapsing, and that means food, water, all the other things that keep cities alive, because cities don't manage and produce themselves. So this is over a decade ago, before Paris actually came in. And then in Paris, there was this upsurge of, positive opportunity in some senses. Many of us were deeply involved in the negotiations at that point of time. And I think we really made the point quite strongly that, especially because of the demographic and economic changes that are happening across the world, cities really have a very important part to play in this process. So cities, in some senses, in the climate conversation, were pretty weak till about 2015-16. So in 15, of course, we were able to insert the urban agenda into the SDG framework, and that cascaded in 2016 into the climate agenda through Paris. It was a little bit weak in SDG because SDG 13 is rather weak in terms of its framing. But if you were able to bring together SDG 11 and the climate agenda that comes out of Paris, we almost got a special report in 2017-18 in the big IPCC meeting in Nairobi. Unfortunately, it didn't happen because of a whole range of complex geopolitical reasons. So we've now got the report, which many of us are involved in working at the moment. So the story is actually not very good. Because in 2018, I co-led the 1.5 report, the special report on 1.5, and we did work on cities on that later. And I think the core message at that time was, things are not looking good. We were at 1.1 degrees at that, between 1.1 and 1.2. We said, look, at every 0.1 degrees, you're going to have significant impact. So try to hold the world below 1.5, and you have to do that by doing mitigation, which is most critical. Mitigation is the most effective way in the long run to avoid extreme adaptation or losses and damages. So that was a story that you could, at that point of time, if we really focused on 5 big transitions which the IPCC has laid out, and I was partially responsible for framing them. If you focus on delivering all of those transformations together, it's possible that we would have held the world at below 1.5. And the urban one is a very important part of them. The energy transition, of course, is happening a little bit slowly in some senses, but there's also the ecosystem one, which is very, very critical. Very often, those of us who work only in urban areas forget that cities are embedded in regions, and regional resilience is as important as trying to maintain the resilience of cities. In fact, cities cannot be resilient unless the regions themselves are resilient around a whole range of other questions. So we said, and I think we had pretty good evidence at that point of time, that if the world really worked and accelerated its processes around all these 5 dimensions: energy, urban infrastructure, ecosystems, making changes on the demand side, on behavior change, and lifestyle change, and of course on industries, we could try and maintain the world at 1.5. But we know just now that we are headed, I would say certainly, I wouldn't say almost certainly, we're headed to a situation where the global average temperatures will definitely exceed 1.5 in the next 5 years or so. So we've gone past that guardrail. The implications for that is and we can see this, we can see this across the world, in cities and in other areas. Every day when you look at social media, you look at, media, you look at the newspapers, etc., you will find the impact happening. There's either a flood or a drought or fire weather, etc. This is kind of known in some senses. We've known this. The science is very clear. So the impacts are starting to ramp themselves up. They will ramp themselves up not linearly, but non-linearly. So the kind of things that have taken even large metropolitan cities like New York, or many areas in the Philippines, in China, also, we saw a really horrible set of cascading effects in Pakistan not so long ago, etc. We've seen massive areas in Australia actually being impacted because of wildfire. So these are going to increase, and they are going to be concentrated in terms of the impacts in urban areas. Not because urban areas attract them, but because urban areas have a large concentration of people. And like we discussed, especially in the global south, many of these people are vulnerable because they're living in places which they shouldn't be living in, which are exposed to flooding, etc., or they are working in occupations which demand them to be exposed to heat. And if you have heat and high humidity at the same time, like I think you're experiencing now, heat waves all over Europe at the point of time, it becomes very difficult. But if you have no choice and you have to go out and earn a livelihood for your family, you're going to, either be severely affected or you might even die. So these processes are going to be concentrated in urban areas because cities have large numbers of people and they are highly vulnerable at the same time. But the inverse is also true. And that is, if we are able to get our act together in urban contexts, and that's why urban adaptation is quite important, along with mitigation, right? If you can do them together, you're able to then very quickly, because of the concentration of people, actually improve the resilience of urban contexts. And this is happening in many parts of the world. The challenge, of course, is the impacts that are coming from the climate side are growing much faster than our responses. So we really have to mobilize to make sure that we're able to try and respond and build resilience really, really fast. Because the impacts are going to come because we've been very unsuccessful in containing emissions. So there was a short slowdown during COVID in some parts of the world, and the environment improved. People could suddenly see the sky, stars. They could even see the mountains in some places. But that has come back with a vengeance in some senses.
Yeah.
And because of the conflicts that we're seeing across the world, we seem to have been, gone back into, the massive overconsumption of fossil fuels, which is neither good for, the economy and certainly not good for cities as far as that's concerned. So that trend of increasing emissions is not slowing down just now. It should have been, dramatically reduced. We should have been on the way to 50% reductions in most parts of the world by 2030. We're, off track, which basically means we're going to exceed 1.5. We will probably exceed 2. And the real thing that even the science doesn't actually know at the moment is how far above that will we go. Because the story that people don't tell you about Paris and all the negotiations that are happening in the COP is that most countries are negotiating at between 2.7 and 3.2. We know that the world is going to be a dramatically different place even at 1.7 degrees. 2.7 is unimaginable. We'll have to abandon a lot of places in the world, including wonderful cities like your own of Barcelona. Maybe not the whole city. And you can imagine 2,500 years of history. You'll have to abandon that, or at least move back, or you will have significant impacts over a period of maybe 1 or 2 decades. That's a really tough thing for us, especially those of us who've been working on city diplomacy and governance like you have. To effect those kind of changes, we don't have the policy instruments, we don't have the institutional mechanisms, we don't even have the politics to be able to speak to those kind of changes. The only politics that we see in such dramatic changes is in the case of conflict, and we don't have a vocabulary to deal with these kind of questions. So yes, the adaptation story is doing very badly. We do need to really accelerate that. It's not that people are not doing things. There are tens of thousands of experiments across the world. The question is, it has to come together. There have to be synergies. We know what the solutions are. We are unable to deploy them, partially because cities themselves are disempowered. They don't have the resources. And also, the forces that are driving this are outside of the control of urban context. They sit in the trade system. They sit in, how fossil fuel exploration takes place, how subsidies are pushed by national governments in many cases, etc. So they're outside the control of city governments. So the question then is, what can you do at the margins?
Yeah. Thank you so much, Aromar. Talking about forces that go beyond the control of city governments, you have worked extensively to bring the climate change and urban agendas together. And the IPCC special report on climate change in cities, the IPCC decision to have it is in itself a landmark decision. Do you think that the contribution of cities to global climate governance is properly acknowledged in nation-state-led official negotiations in key intergovernmental decision-making bodies, particularly COP?
Well, the simple answer is no.
Yeah.
It's very unfortunate, but that's a simple and the true answer. I mean, we made some progress. In COP22 in Sharm el Sheikh, COP27, sorry, in Sharm el Sheikh, we launched a series of special of reports which summarized the entire IPCC cycle as far as cities are concerned. So there was a summary for urban policymakers that were launched by the top people at the IPCC. It was a very widely publicized event, etc. So essentially, what we said is the science is clear. We know what the challenges of cities are. We also know what the solutions are, and we know what can enable the solutions to work. So better governance, like you're saying, more financing, mobilization of the right kind of institutions as far as it's concerned. In some cases, better technology, etc. So we know what the solutions are. The question is how can you deploy them? And the challenge, of course, is that the deployment, especially in the COP framework, because in intergovernmental framework, depends on the reorganization of governance inside national territories. So the good news from Sharm el Sheikh was the first, interministerial that brought together ministers of urban development actually happened. I was there. I was sitting in the front row of that convening that was there. So the good news is many countries actually acknowledge the opportunity that urbanization and cities provided to deal with questions of both mitigation, adaptation, and of course later, because loss and damages actually started happening at Sharm el Sheikh and then picked up in the next two COPs as far as that's concerned. But if you looked at the pool of 100 or 90 odd countries, there were maybe 60 in the room, and maybe some of the larger countries which had larger urban populations were not in the room in the first place. So the challenge is the imagination of the climate, intergovernmental climate negotiation process is obviously sitting around, the country governments. That's how it's been constructed. And that's how, starting from all the way back from Rio in 92 onwards, the discussion is taking place. The challenge, the practical challenges in the 90s, I would say even in the early 2000s, you could potentially address critical questions in the climate space by bringing together national governments, especially, countries that were fossil fuel exporters, those that were very large consumers, including India, China, and various other industrialized countries. If you could, by bringing them together, and they would be probably less than maybe a third of the number of countries, maybe even a fourth that were members of the UN at that point of time. Bring them into conversation with the industry, especially the fossil fuel industry, with oil, gas, coal, etc. Meant that with a few hundred people in the room, if you were able to negotiate effectively, if you agreed on a way forward, and you got the financing, which is bringing another few hundred people in the room, you could actually potentially solve the problem. Fine, because it was at that point of time the question of how do you keep things underground, don't dig up too much fossil fuels, how do you transition to renewables based industry, which is a very big one, not small. But the economics of renewables have become very clear and obvious, and even large countries like China, which are very large emitters, are now making very dramatic shifts to the renewable side, let's say. But that didn't happen. So what is the implication as far as it's concerned? You move from maybe a few dozen countries and maybe 100 corporations, maybe 100, 200 financial institutions. That's a few, maybe 500, 600 entities in some senses, to the world being impacted. So now the challenge is being felt by, anywhere between 3 and 5 billion people, which means the solutions also have to come from those 3 to 5 billion people. Fine. Which means by inevitably the class of problem is shifted. So the arenas for engagement, the arenas for actually solving them have also shifted. Now, if those folks who are actually at the cutting edge of both the impacts and the solution space are not anywhere near the negotiations, you're in a very difficult place, because the folks who are trying to negotiate, or the institutions that are trying to negotiate this thing, actually have no control, no agency, and no feedback from the people who are at the coalface of dealing with this question. And they don't have the resources. In some cases, they don't even have the adequate science, because science is typically focused at the national level and not at the local level as far as it's concerned. They are struggling to deal with this question, and they have neither a place in the room, nor do they have a voice. Now, hopefully that is changing a little bit, but given the fragmentation in the global geopolitical space at the current point of time, and the fact that some very large countries are moving in a completely opposite direction, in a direction which is, I would say, very contrarian as far as climate is concerned. Because climate is a fact, it's a real thing. It's happening. You can step out of your house pretty much anywhere in the world, and you can start seeing this, on a monthly basis, if not on a daily basis. So we really have a serious challenge in this space, and there aren't very many institutions and countries who are willing to confront this. because the challenges of governance that countries are facing today in a world that is economically fragmented, that has multiple conflicts happening, even in geographies that are better endowed, like Europe and in West Asia, etc. Uh, so there's a serious challenge here, and I think cities and city diplomacy and city governments are reaching out and trying to build solidarity among themselves, but that is not enough. Things have to change inside national governance frameworks. The role of urban contexts and urban areas has to shift in terms of political power, in terms of governance, in terms of agency, in terms of mandates, in terms of resources, in terms of financing. If your primary instrument or set of people who are dealing with something are disempowered, how can you expect to address a wicked problem? And this wicked problem has teleconnections across the world. Right? Something that will be happening in Greenland or Antarctica is going to impact some, even a landlocked country in some senses. So we have to think systemically, and local governments and local responses, because adaptation has now become central to the process, because it's about water, it's about too much heat, it's about firestorms, it's about a whole range of other impacts that we are aware of. It's just common sense in some senses that the key stakeholders have to be involved. And if you don't do that, there's no way that you will impact the problem at all, which essentially means that fragility will increase, conflict will increase, and large number of people across the world, irrespective of geography, are going to have to move. And that's a really bad outcome in some senses for both the people who are moving and the places where they're moving from and the places they're moving to. So this is kind of, you're locked into that kind of framework. So we have to think very, very differently now. I think these old ideas, which are, they worked in the 20th century, do not work in our contexts now. And we have to be very frank about this, and we have to be very determined about calling out processes and institutions and contexts that are actually putting not only the planet at risk, that's obvious in some senses, but very large populations at risk, and populations of people who had nothing to do with the problem in the first place.
Yeah. Talking about things that have to change at the national government level, geopolitical tensions and national interest are increasingly affecting multilateral spaces where international cooperation is required to address transnational challenges that go beyond the capacity of individual nation states to solve. This return of geopolitics, how do you think is affecting cities?
Well, I don't think there's a return of geopolitics. Geopolitics has always been present. Those of us who work on this question and have engaged with any of these processes know that geopolitics never ran away. There was, I would say, in some senses, a confused narrative for a while, maybe for a decade or so, about the end of history and the end of geography, etc. But those of us who actually worked in this space know that's not true. I mean, just in a very, very simple thing. I've written about this and I've spoken about this for more than 20 years. It was pretty obvious to us at the turn of the millennium that the center of the global economy is going to shift to the Indian Ocean and the Pacific in 20 odd years. I mean, you look at the long range trend, and it was kind of obvious, both in terms of people, in terms of economic output, in terms of trade and stuff like that. So, and that's the heart of geopolitics in some senses. Centers become peripheries, peripheries become centers, and because the dynamics of where things are coming from and where they're going are going to shift, whether it's people or economic activity or technological innovation, etc. And this changes over time, right? Now, that is the immediate context, but the fact is that we're living on a planet that is over full of people and what people do. We produce more artifacts and more artificial things than what nature produces now for over 10 years. So we're actually we're a geological force as a species in some senses, and that has some advantages because we are so rich. We have we have a $100 trillion plus economy. We can pretty much do what we want to do if we were to be able to apply our innovation and our capacities equitably and properly. But in actual fact, many of the core values that we've seen have not changed over time, whether it's on conflict or inequality, etc. So essentially, we have many of the solutions in our hands, but our systems of governance of trying to solve problems are just completely out of whack. They're actually just not fit for purpose as far as these questions are concerned. Like I was giving you the example in the climate space, that's the same thing can be true of trade. The same thing is absolutely true for biodiversity, etc., etc., etc. So, given that we are in a world in which inequality is both increasing, and because of that, conflict is surfacing much more significantly. I mean, it's not that conflict went away in the 1990s and the 2000s. There was conflict. There was also interstate conflict and all that other kind of stuff, as far as that's concerned. Maybe not of the kind of scale that we saw in the mid 20th century. And thankfully, in nuclear world, we haven't gone into that spaces yet. But the fact is, geopolitics has always been here. There's no question about that. It's just that the geographies have changed, and because of that, we sometimes get confused to understand, how the things are playing out. But in spite of the changing of changing geopolitics, some things have not shifted, and one of those things that has not shifted is actually the power, the agency, and in a sense, the mandate of local processes to address not only local questions, that of course is by definition, but also to deal with regional and global questions. And we saw this so clearly in COVID.
Mhm.
You know, COVID was absolutely, it was a preparation, a wake up call for people across the world and national governments. And frankly, at least in my appreciation, I was on a couple of large commissions that looked at this question from the scientific point of view. Local governments actually did much better than most national governments. Some national governments did well, but local governments typically did a lot better because they were in touch with the ground. They were able to think holistically. It was a wicked problem as far as that's concerned. So, and the geopolitics was there for everybody to see in terms of vaccine access, in terms of what kind of movements were possible, the kind of support that's available to kickstart the global and regional economies. So that's the same story that's going to be played out. I would say in much larger numbers, and hopefully not so badly in other contexts. So the challenge is in our imagination and our willingness to bite the bullet on trying to address problems in places where they can be addressed, and try and stop, the sources or the places from where they're emanating from. And much of the emanation of these things comes from the fact that there are some systems in the global economy or global polity that have no governance at all. We don't have effective global governance of the global financial system. There's been a lot of effort that's been happening in the last 10 years or so, and we're in the middle of, I mean, it's next to you. FFT4 is happening in Seville at the current point of time. The fact is that large numbers of people in the world in many countries do need to be financed because of historical and actual reasons that are there. And there are going to be consequences if the finances are not made available. The amount of financing that's required is not a huge amount to be able to put children into school, to improve healthcare, improve the quality of life in cities. They're not large numbers of money in terms of the global framework, because the global economy is growing very quickly. But we're still not making these things available because we're getting distracted by things that do not make sense and actually don't work for us in many ways. So the geopolitics is part of that engagement, and we should not use that as a way of taking cover and saying there are geopolitical tensions in my region, and hence I should forget about basic things like healthcare, education, services, etc. Life has to continue, and you cannot maintain a productive, forget about equitable global economy without addressing these questions. We have to address them, I would say, absolutely face on. And if you don't address them, there will be consequences. And one of the consequences is increasing inequality, the return of poverty into many places in the global north, where we would not have expected even a decade ago, or certainly 2 decades ago, to see poverty return. It is unacceptable when you have a high income country to have a situation where you have a large number of people who are increasingly poor or disadvantaged. You have the technology, you have the resources, you have the governance systems, and you have to reimagine how those systems actually work. And this is not only it's true pretty much across the world. We have a paucity of the willingness to go out and take on difficult questions. And I think centers like yourselves are going to be really important in being able to take. This is a universal challenge. I wouldn't say not every part of the world, but this is something and like I said, COVID is such a good example of that. Taking these experiences and saying, look, It's not only in our region, it's in 7 other regions that this kind of stuff is happening. They found their solutions. Can we apply the same context in our own context? How can we apply it to the province in which we are, in Catalonia? How does it apply to Spain? Then how does it reach out to Brussels and the European Union? These are questions that we have to engage with, because if you don't engage with them, this idea of carrying on as if nothing never ever happened or life can go on as usual is going to be very, very painful for a whole range of us, and it's going to set us back by a couple of generations. It's not a good thing to do. It's unfortunate in some senses. When you can see the future, when you have the solutions in your hand, you know what can be done, and you still are blind to the fact that you have to change your culture of governance. You've got to change your lifestyles. You've got to change your behavior, and you have to embrace other people, because it's in solidarity only that we can find collective responses to these questions. Not all of these questions can be addressed to competition, whether it's competition within countries or firms or even between municipalities. A lot of this stuff is collective work. It cannot be done in fragmented ways.
Thank you so much, Aromar. So instead of talking about the return of geopolitics, since geopolitics were always there, we should start talking about the return of poverty in context where poverty had disappeared and it's back again.
Unfortunately so. It's a tragedy.
Yeah.
Because we have to deal with poverty in the rest of the world too, fine?
Yeah. Absolutely. So I would drop it here because we have already exceeded. You have already been very kind with your time, and close the conversation here. Thank you so much, Aromar, for your time, for your expertise across different topics, because we really talked about many different topics over these 52 minutes of conversation. Very much looking forward to further possibilities to discuss together. Of course, to read the special report on climate change in cities once it is out, but it's not ready.
27 March. We still got a year and a half to go. Yeah.
Very much look forward to it. Yeah, but of course, I assume that you guys still have to work a lot before the.
Oh yes, we are working very hard.
Yeah, I mean, I've talked with other colleagues who are also working, and yeah, I can understand it's a huge working process. So thank you very much, Aromar. See you next time, and take care. Thank you all. Bye bye.